The fire in the hay burner had gone to gray ash an hour before, and the one room of the house was still warm enough that Marta Vesey worked at the table in her sleeves. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the doorframe stood at 32 below and had not lifted in 6 days. The wind off the open flats drove the snow along the ground in long white ropes and piled it to the sills. It was the 3rd week of January. In the winter the homesteaders of Hurdle Creek would afterward call the blizzard year, the winter of 1898, when the killing cold settled down over that whole treeless stretch of the Nebraska Sandhills and simply stayed. Up and down the creek, the thin board shanties the district had been so proud of were failing one after another. In every one of them a stove was being fed all through the night with whatever would burn: fence posts, seed corn, hay twisted hard into knots, the boards off a stable wall. And still the frost came in around the window sashes, and still the water pails froze solid within arm's reach of the fire. But in Orrin Vesey's house the walls were 2 full feet thick, and one small fire lit at dusk had left them holding heat like the side of a baker's oven. And they would go on holding it till morning, and they had held it all that winter on less fuel than any household on the creek burned in a single night. So when Cyrus Ledbetter came knocking near midnight, with the frost gone white in his beard and his own load of good freighted pine long since sent up his stovepipe, he stepped in over the sill, felt the warm, still air standing in that room like water in a cistern, and could not for a moment say the thing he had ridden 4 miles through 32 below to say. Every man on Hurdle Creek had called that house a haystack. To understand how a house stacked out of baled straw held its warmth through the killing winter while sawn lumber freighted 80 miles from the railroad failed all around it, the story has to go back a half-dozen years to a summer afternoon in a hay meadow and a lean claim holder standing over a horsepower press, looking at a wire-tied block of pressed grass and seeing in it the only building stone the Sandhills had ever offered anyone. The Nebraska Sandhills were a country that gave a settler almost nothing to build with. They were dunes, in plain fact a vast rolling sea of sand that the grass had caught and held, mile on mile of it, without a tree in sight, without a stone bigger than a knuckle, without so much as a decent clay bank in a day's ride. Eastward, on the hard tall-grass prairie, a homesteader cut sod bricks a foot wide out of ground, so thickly rooted that a plow groaned at it, and raised himself a warm sod house that would stand 30 years and better. In the Sandhills that trick failed. The sod there lay thin over loose sand, and it crumbled coming off the plow. Walls raised of it sagged and sifted and went back to dune inside a season. There was no timber but a few crooked cottonwoods down in the wet valleys, and no rock at all. Whatever lumber a man wanted, he freighted, 80 miles up from the railroad by wagon, 4 days out and 4 days back, at a price that made every board a small tragedy. Into this country in the spring of 1892 came Orrin Vesey, then in his late 30s, a lean, weather-burnt man with a drooping sand-colored mustache, pale squinting eyes, and hands cracked open across the knuckles from wire and frozen grass, who filed on a quarter section in the hills north of Hurdle Creek with his wife, Marta, a short, broad-shouldered woman with dark hair pinned flat and a slow way of speaking that made men wait on her. They had money enough for 1 wagon load of pine and no more. They spent their first 2 winters in a dugout scooped into the south face of a dune, and both of them understood before the second of those winters was out. that they would either find some other way to build in that country or they would leave it. Everyone else on the creek built the same way because it was the only way anybody knew. A man saved or borrowed what he could and bought a load of pine, and out of it he raised a shanty, a single thickness of boards nailed upright to a light frame, battened over the cracks with laths, papered on the outside with tar paper if he could afford the paper, and roofed thin. It went up in a week, and from a little distance it looked like a proper house, square corners, a peaked roof, sawn boards, the mark of a man who was getting on in the world. And against a Sandhills winter it was very nearly nothing at all. An inch of pine and a sheet of paper stood between a household and 30 below. The wind came through the batten cracks in fine cold knives, the walls sweated and then frosted on the inside, the stove had to be fed hard and steady from dark to dark, and the moment it sank the cold came into the room as though the boards were not there. The man who sold most of that pine and who hauled it up from the cars himself with a 4-horse team and a trail wagon was Cyrus Ledbetter. A big, ruddy man with a spade-shaped black beard, a good wool coat off the cars, and a laugh he used the way other men use their fists. Ledbetter was the foremost man on that stretch of the creek. He had the biggest shanty, the best team, the freight contract, and a settled opinion, which he gave away freely to anyone within hearing. That a man who could not keep a house warm in that country had simply not bought enough lumber. It was a sick calf that gave Orrin Vesey the notion, though he was a long while understanding what he had been shown. In the fall of 1894, a hay press came into the country, one of the horsepower balers then working their way west, a squat iron machine with a sweep arm that a team walked in a circle. That took the loose meadow hay, a man forked into it and pressed it down and spat it out at the far end in hard rectangular blocks bound about with wire. The Sandhills, poor in every other thing, were rich past all reckoning in grass. The low, wet meadows between the dunes grew hay to a man's waist, and every settler in the hills cut and stacked it. And now here was a machine that would squeeze it into blocks a wagon could carry. Orrin baled his meadow that fall and had bales left over, and he stacked the surplus in a double row to make a windbreak pen for a calf that had come down sick. A 3-day blizzard came through in November. In Ledbetter's board stable, half a mile off, the stock stood the storm out shivering, and 2 head were lost. In the little pen of stacked bales, out in the open, with nothing over it but a scrap of canvas, the calf came through the whole of it dry, quiet, and warm to the hand. When the wind dropped, Orrin stood at that pen a long time. Then he put his bare palm flat against the inside face of the bale wall, and it was not cold. He thought about it all that winter in the dugout. A bale off that press ran near 3 feet long and something under 2 feet through, and it weighed the better part of 90 pounds, and it was not really grass at all, it was air. 10,000 hollow stems pressed hard together, every hollow of every stem full of still air, and the whole of it locked so tight that no wind alive could stir a breath of it from one face to the other. He came at the rest of it plainly, the way a man does who has spent his life outdoors and thinks with his hands. Cold does not come through a wall, warmth goes out through it, and what carries warmth out is moving air and solid matter. A pine board was solid and thin, and it passed the heat straight through and out into the night. A sod wall did better, but only because it was thick, and it was heavy with damp, and it wanted a foot of itself to do what a hand's breadth of dead still air would do. 2 feet of pressed straw was almost nothing but dead still air, with barely enough matter in it to hold the air in place. It would let the warmth of a fire out about as fast as a good coat lets it out of a man, which is to say slowly and grudgingly and over a great many hours. He had lived near 40 years without once thinking about any of it. Now he could not stop thinking about it, and every acre of that empty, worthless, treeless country grew the stuff shoulder high and gave it away for the cutting. So, in the summer of 1895, Orrin Vesey did a thing no man in that district had ever seen done. He cut and pressed his hay early and hard, held back the tightest and driest of the bales, and then, on a level bench of ground a little back from the meadow, he began to lay them up like brick. He set them flat on their long sides, staggered course upon course, so that no two joints ever ran through, and drove sharpened willow stakes down through each course into the one beneath to pin the whole together. The wall went up 2 feet thick and better than the height of a tall man, and it went up fast, what would have kept a mason a month standing in 4 days, because a bale is a brick 100 times the size of a brick. He left openings for 2 small windows and a door, and framed them out with what pine he had. Across the top he spiked a plate of planks, and on the plate he set his rafters, and roofed the whole with boards and paper, keeping the eaves tight and short, because he did not want the Sandhills wind getting a hand up under them. And then he plastered it. He mixed clay from the one good bank on his place with lime he had freighted in, and he troweled it hard and smooth over the straw, inside and out, sealing every crack of it tight against the weather, the way a careful man seals a house. When he was done, there stood on that bare rise a squat, pale, plastered box with walls thicker than a bank vault's, and in the last of those steps he had made a mistake that would come very near to costing him everything. Hurdle Creek named the house before the plaster was dry. The Vesey Haystack, they called it, the cow's dinner. Cyrus Ledbetter rode out to look at it and sat his horse at the edge of the yard and laughed until he had to take his hat off to do it. 3 things, Vesey, he said, holding up 3 fingers. It will rot, it will burn, and the first big wind will lay it across the flat in Windrose. The district agreed on all 3 counts, and there was sense in every one of them. Straw rots. Every man there had pulled black spoiled hay out of the bottom of a stack in the spring. Straw burns, and he was a household proposing to live inside a haystack with a stovepipe coming out of the roof of it, and a fire going day and night, and the nearest help 40 minutes hard ride away. And straw blows. Anybody who had watched a Sandhills gale take the top off a stack knew what wind did to loose hay. Orrin answered the fire charge once, and never troubled to answer it again. He set a hard bale on its end in the yard, with the men standing round, and struck a match and held the flame against the cut face of it. And the straw ends charred and blackened and glowed a moment, and went out, and then he pulled a loose handful from the middle of it and touched the same match to that, and it went up in a flash and was gone in 2 seconds. Packed tight enough, he told them, there is no air left in it to burn. The men allowed it was a good trick, and went on calling the place a haystack. That first winter the house was warm, and everyone who came into it had to allow that it was warm, and by March it was rotting. It began at the bottom, where nobody was looking. The walls, set flat on the level sand, were drinking damp up out of the ground the way a lamp wick drinks oil, and the hard, smooth lime plaster Orrin had troweled on so carefully inside and out, had sealed that damp in with nowhere on earth to go. Worse, the warm, wet air off the stove pushed out into the straw all winter long, struck the cold outer face of the wall, and turned to water there in the dark of it. By the thaw, the bottom course had gone soft and dark and sour. There was a smell in the room in the mornings like the inside of a spoiled stack. Long blisters of plaster began to loosen and slough off the outside wall and sheets, showing black straw behind them, and when Orrin pulled a handful out, it came away in a wet rope, half rotted through, and stank in his hand. The word went down the creek inside a week. Ledbetter did not even trouble to ride out and see it. He told it at the store, and told it well. And the district settled the matter with a good deal of satisfaction. It had rotted. They had said it would rot. Nobody was much surprised, and nobody but Marta would hear anything else said about it. Orrin Vesey spent the worst week of his life at that wall, and then, kneeling in the mud of his own yard with a rope of black straw in his fist, he saw it. He had built the walls right and finished them exactly wrong, and he had finished them wrong because he had been thinking about a board house the whole time he did it. Everything he knew of building told him that a wall is a barrier, that the whole business of it is to keep the weather on the outside, to seal it, to shut it, to make it tight. And so he had wrapped 2 feet of dry straw in a hard shell of lime and closed off every road the damp had to get back out by. But a straw wall was not a board wall and would not be handled as one. It was a great dry sponge, and a sponge has to be let to dry. It did not want sealing, it wanted a way out. Keep it up off the wet ground, keep the rain off the top of it, and then let the wall breathe, let the damp walk out through the plaster as freely as it ever walked in. And the straw inside would stay as dry and hard as the day it came out of the press. Give it good boots and a good hat, he came to say afterward, and it will never want a raincoat. He had spent a year trying to keep the weather out of his wall when the whole art of the thing was to let his wall dry. 2 feet of pressed straw would carry a household through anything the Sandhills could bring. It only had to be kept dry to do it, and it could not be kept dry by being shut up tight. So he took the house down to the 3rd course and built it back, and it cost him the whole summer of 1896. He laid a stem wall of rammed sand and creek gravel a good 2 feet clear above the level of the ground, capped it, and set his bottom course of bales on that, high and dry above the damp, good boots. He tore off his tight short eaves and framed them out wide, a full 2 feet of overhang all the way round, so that the rain came off the roof and fell clear of the wall instead of running down its face, a good hat. And he plastered it again, but not as he had plastered it before. He laid on a soft, thick first coat of clay mixed with chopped straw, worked hard into the face of the bales so that it keyed deep between the stems and gripped them, and over that only a thin skin of lime, brushed on and left rough. It was not a shell and was never meant to be one. It shed rain, and it let vapor walk straight out through it, and a wall finished that way would give back on a July afternoon whatever damp a January night had driven into it. He cut his bales late in the season when the grass was dry to the root, and pressed them harder than the press was built to press, and kept them under canvas until the hour they went up into the wall. When the second house stood finished it looked much like the first, a squat, pale, thick-walled box with deep-shadowed windows, and it was not the same house at all. The rebuilding did him no good whatever in the eyes of the creek. If anything, it made matters worse, for a man who builds a fool thing once may be forgiven it, and a man who builds it twice is simply a fool. All through the summer of 1896, the district watched Orrin Vesey take down a house he had already been laughed at for and put it back up again, and made what it liked of that. At the store they asked him whether he meant to rebuild the place every year and whether he had thought of thatching the roof to match the walls. Ledbetter, hauling past on the freight road, would rein up at the edge of the yard and offer, in the same friendly booming voice he used for everything, to sell him a good load of pine at a fair price and hear no more about it. Marta Vesey, a short, broad-shouldered woman with dark hair pinned flat and a slow way of speaking that made men wait on her, took it harder than her husband did. She felt it in the pews and across the store counter, in the small turnings away that women manage without a syllable spoken, and there was a night late in that summer. The two of them sitting out against the half-built wall in the dark, when she asked him, quietly, whether it was worth being the standing joke of a whole creek. Orrin said that a joke was a cheap price, and that the winners would settle the argument one way or the other, and that if he was wrong, they would know it inside of 2 years and could buy their pine then. He believed it. She chose to. The country did not wait long to try the other two charges. In June of 1897, a straight-line wind came down the flats after dark and took the roof off Cyrus Ledbetter's shanty entire, carried it 100 yards into a draw, and laid 2 of his walls over on their sides, and it went on down the creek and stripped tar paper off half the shanties on it. It did nothing at all to the Vesey house. It could not. A wall of pressed straw 2 feet thick and plastered on both faces weighs many tons and has no more interest in wind than a clay bank has. The storm went over it and around it and away, and in the morning there was not so much as a crack in the lime. Then, in the dry October of that same year, a range fire got away on the West Flats and ran the country for 11 miles. It burned 4 haystacks, a stable, and a board shanty down to the nail heads, and it came over the Vesey place with the wind behind it and left the straw house scorched brown along one side and otherwise untouched. Because plaster does not burn, and there was no air inside those bales for a fire to live on. Orrin relimed the scorched face in an afternoon. The district took note of both those things and was not much moved by either. Wind is one matter, and fire is another, the men said down at the store. Warm is a third, and nobody had yet seen what that house would do in a winter that meant business. The winter that meant business came the next year. The fall of 1897 ran dry and then hardened early. The meadows froze a month before their time, and the old hands who read the geese and the coats on the horses cut extra hay and said little about why. The first blizzard came the week before Christmas and did not so much pass over as move in to stay. Then, in the 3rd week of January, the great cold came down behind it, the still, hard, windless, killing kind that settles over an open country under a clear sky and simply sits, day after day, while the glass falls and then stops falling because it has nowhere further to go. 32 below at Orrin Vesey's door, 34 one night, and it did not lift for 11 days. It froze the meadow ponds to the mud and snapped the wire on the fences with a sound like a shot. In a country with no timber, a cold of that kind is not simply a hardship. It is a sum with a hard answer at the bottom of it, and every household on Hurdle Creek was made to sit down and work that sum. There was no wood to burn. There had never been any wood to burn. What the district burned was hay and cow chips and corn and whatever boards it could bring itself to tear off something else, and against 32 below, coming through an inch of pine, not one of those was near enough. The board shanties failed, one after another, the whole length of the creek, and they failed for the very thing their owners had been proudest of. A single thickness of pine holds nothing. A stove in such a house can be roared cherry red, and it will warm the air in the room handsomely. And that air will be out through the walls and gone in 20 minutes. And so the feeding never stops. The households of Hurdle Creek fed their stoves through the black hours in shifts, sleeping in relays, and watched their fuel go down like a snowbank in a chinook. They burned the hay they had cut for the stock, twisting it hard into knots so that it would burn slow, until the stacks were gone. Then they burned the fence posts, hauled up frozen out of the ground with a chain. Then the seed corn, then the boards off the stable stalls, and then the stalls themselves, and a wagon box and a bedstead, and the shelving off the kitchen wall. Cyrus Ledbetter, who had the biggest shanty on that creek and a fine load of pine laid by for a stable he meant to raise in the spring, put the whole of that load through his stove in 6 days and was cold at the end of it, and on the 7th day he started in on the stable he already had. Up and down that stretch of country, households that had measured their standing in the world by the sawn lumber in their walls stood at last in freezing rooms with nothing left to put in the fire, wrapped in everything they owned while the frost came in over their sills. Every house on Hurdle Creek but one, on the rise north of the creek. Inside 2 feet of pressed straw plastered smooth with clay and lime, the Vesey household lit one small fire of twisted hay in the morning and one at dusk, and lived warm. That was the whole of it, and there was nothing else to it. The heat of those 2 small fires had almost nowhere to go. It soaked into the thick plastered inner face of the walls and stayed in it, giving itself back into the room slow and even through all the hours between, and what little of it worked outward into the straw took the better part of a day to find the far side. The room never swung. It did not roast at 9 and freeze at 3 the way the board houses did. It held one mild, steady warmth from one end of the day around to the other. Marta Vesey, a short, broad-shouldered woman with dark hair pinned flat and a slow way of speaking that made men wait on her, kept bread rising on the shelf by the door through the coldest week of that winter, and not once in the whole of it did she see frost on the inside of her own window glass. The water, pale by the door, never skinned over. And Orrin slept the nights through without rising to feed anything, which no other man on that creek could say, and burned in the entire 11 days of the killing cold rather less hay than Ledbetter's stove ate between one dusk and the next morning. It was on the 6th night of the great cold that Cyrus Ledbetter came knocking at the Vesey door near midnight. He had ridden 4 miles with the wind quartering into his face, and his own house stood behind him as cold as the open flat, and he had burned in a week every board he could tear loose from anything he owned. He was a big, ruddy man with a spade-shaped black beard, a good wool coat off the cars, and a laugh he used the way other men used their fists, and he did not laugh on that threshold. Warm air rolled out around him into the killing night. Inside, the lamp was low, and the fire had been dead in the hay burner 3 hours, and the room was as mild as an evening in May. Ledbetter stood in the middle of the floor with the frost melting out of his beard, and then he did the thing that every man who ever came into that house ended by doing. He put out his bare hand and laid the palm of it flat against the inside wall. In his own house the wall was a plank, and the plank was the same temperature as the night behind it. This one was warm. Orrin Vesey did not say one word about haystacks. He never in his life said a word to any man about haystacks. He pulled a chair around to the warm wall and sat the frozen man down in it, and told Marta to put something hot inside him, and the 3 of them sat there a long while and said none of the things that did not need saying. When the cold broke at last, and the district came out to count what it had cost, the reckoning was a thing men spoke of quietly for a generation afterward. Stock dead in the stables. Hay burned that had been meant to carry the cattle through to grass, so that what the cold had not killed the spring hunger took instead. Fences burned. Furniture burned. 2 households on the creek doubled up with neighbors because they had torn their own houses half to pieces feeding the stove. Some in that county had come very near to dying of it. And through all of it, on the rise north of the creek, a house the whole district had named after a haystack had carried its household on 2 small fires a day, and had never once needed anything cut, hauled, or bought to do it. Nobody used the old name after that winter. It did not have to be forbidden. It simply fell out of use. In the spring, the men came up to the Vesey place 1 and 2 at a time, awkward, turning their hats in their hands, to stand inside those walls and feel for themselves how a thick house feels, and to ask him how a man went about the building of one. Orrin told them plainly, for he had never seen the sense in keeping a good thing to himself. Cut late and press hard, he said, because a soft bale is a sponge and a hard one is a stone. Set the bottom course up on a footing well clear of the ground. Give the roof 2 full feet of overhang all round. Plaster both faces, clay first, work deep into the straw, and only a thin skin of lime over that. And never, on any account, seal it, for a straw wall must be let to breathe, or it will rot in the dark where no one can see it happening. And they built. There were 4 straw houses along Hurdle Creek by the fall of 1899 and 11 the year after, and then a baled schoolhouse on the section corner, and in time a store and a church raised the same way. And the notion went out of that district into the hills all around it and stayed there for 50 years. Because it worked, and because the Sandhills went on having no timber and endless grass. Cyrus Ledbetter built his in the summer after the blizzard year, and hauled his own bales to do it, and afterward discovered, being a man who followed his freight wherever it led, that there was better money in bringing up baling wire and lime than pine, and hauled those instead. He and Orrin never grew close, but they grew easy with one another, in the way of 2 men who have sat out a cold together that could have finished them both. Years later, a newcomer asked Ledbetter how it came about that half the houses in that country were built of hay, and Ledbetter tipped his black beard up the rise toward the Vesey place and said only that there had been a man up there who looked at the poorest country in Nebraska and noticed the one thing it had too much of, while the rest of them were paying 4 days' freight each way for boards that would not hold a single night's heat. Orrin Vesey lived out the remainder of his life in the house the district had called a cow's dinner, and never once in all those years reminded any man on the creek what he had been called. He would say only the thing he had worked out for himself. Kneeling in the mud of his own yard the spring the wall rotted, and he would say it to anybody who came up the rise to ask, that every country grows the house that suits it, and a man has merely to look at what it grows too much of. The Sandhills had been growing his, shoulder high and mile on mile, for as long as there had been anybody out there to be cold in it.